You don't need me to tell you all the ways that coronavirus has bent the world over and given us all a good COVIDing. But while we're depressingly familiar with the willful misinterpretation of science by those with ulterior motives, the contribution of scientists themselves to the confusion has flown a little bit under the radar unless you're particularly interested in the field. This is not a video about conspiracy theories. If you want to see that, you can just open Facebook. This is not a video about governments ignoring actual science or the media overhyping unproven therapies. If you want to see that, you can just switch on the news. And I'm not going to be picking the low-hanging fruit by making fun of idiotic politicians or Karens. If you want to see that, you can just switch on the late-night talk shows. Only joking, nobody's watching those. No, this is a video where I'm going to be concentrating on scientists who have actually made things worse. Don't get me wrong, those aforementioned groups, like politicians and the media, deserve a lot, perhaps most of the blame. But scientists are people who should have known better. If you're new to this channel, I guess I could summarize two of the main messages I try to convey by saying, always look beyond medical headlines to examine the evidence and appreciate that uncertainty is inherent to science. A phrase that's wound me up all year has been the UK government repeatedly saying, "We're following the science." You might have heard similar things in your own country. The statement pisses me off because it implies that science is like deep thought, a big computer that spits out solutions, that science gives clear answers to complicated questions. But that's not really how it works. So I'm going to present some of the worst travesties of science. Obviously just a few, or this video would have been hours long, and I'll tie them all together with a common thread at the end. I've actually had this video title in mind since mid-March. I can pinpoint the exact moment that I realised science had been killed, and over the last 5 months we've just been beating its lifeless carcass into a pulp, as study after study has been published, and rough estimate, about 80% are complete trash. And by that I mean absolute total garbage. The vast majority, and we're talking not hundreds but thousands upon thousands of studies, would have been rejected by any sensible journal, but something called preprint servers have exploded. Preprints are papers that have not been peer-reviewed. A research team just posts their paper up online. The idea is reasonable, get info out there as soon as possible, especially during a pandemic, but there's no quality control. These were not read by anyone outside the research team before going online. They were intended for scientists to share information with each other for feedback, but now millions of eyeballs are on them, ready to believe whatever they see. That moment that I mentioned when I realized that science had been murdered was, do you remember right at the beginning there was this big thing about not using ibuprofen? It spread like wildfire. Within a day or so it seemed to have gone around the world. COVID was this scary new disease. We didn't know how to defeat it. We didn't know when it would hit our shores, but we knew one thing: don't use ibuprofen. It was a little handhold of certainty on this vertical viral rock face. But just as ibuprofen was being cancelled for problematic behaviour, I wondered, why though? So I started digging. To cut a long story short, there was no more evidence than a single line in a theoretical paper without any data, and a couple of dudes in France who had seen some bad stuff and decided to raise the alarm. Now, anecdotes and theories do have a place in medicine, but instead of people saying, "Oh, we better check this out," they defaulted to caution, which I guess is also understandable, but it set a precedent. There were no proper studies, and yet every medical WhatsApp group I'm in was sending this stuff around like it was the word of God. The WHO adopted it as policy, and so on. It's not a particularly important thing, but I knew at that moment that COVID was going to pervert science like never before, but I could have never imagined by how much. Next came the clearly preposterous claim that smoking protects people from COVID. Now, come on, does that even sound feasible? Alarm bells should ring straight away. But Rohin, you say, there's evidence here. A large British study appeared to show smokers were protected. Now, this is a little teaching point about how stats can mislead, which could be a long video in itself. It's something called collider bias. It's hard to explain this briefly, so I'm going to leave some references below which are really good and I urge you to check them out. Collider bias occurs when you attempt to compare a single relationship across two groups, in this case, smoking status and COVID severity. In order to do this, you have to try to cancel out differences between the groups, correct for things like heart disease or lung disease, which may be discrepancies may exist. But some of the differences you correct for are actually affected by smoking itself. like heart disease or lung disease. So you might end up with stats that suggest smoking is beneficial due to erroneous correction and or missing information. For example, if you compare smokers admitted to hospital with COVID to non-smokers admitted to hospital with COVID, they're not the same. The smokers are significantly younger because smoking has made them more susceptible. But because they're younger, they're less likely to have other medical problems associated with age, like diabetes, heart disease, and so on. And we know that age and comorbidities are the main things that increase your risk. So, as I said, it's a bit hard to explain briefly, but do check out those references. The tendency to attribute a causal relationship to a correlation wasn't going to end there. Everyone had a hot take about blood pressure medication because of potentially sharing a signaling pathway with the virus, and millions of people needlessly stopped their medication, the ACE inhibitors, which almost certainly did harm. More recently, we were told that one of the most commonly prescribed medications in the world, proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole or lansoprazole, which we give for acid reflux, were a risk factor for COVID. Okay, the biological mechanism isn't immediately clear there, but let's take a look at the data. And it's pretty bad. The study claimed to have tens of thousands of responses to an online survey. First off, as anyone who has ever tried to get people to fill in online surveys will know, no one ever bloody does them, so this number is seriously impressive. Almost too impressive. Secondly, online surveys are at best appalling sources of data, but even so, the results they got, which were supposed to be representative of the USA as a whole, were completely haywire. 6% were COVID positive, which is higher than the proportion out of all people tested. 3/4 were between 30 to 39 years old. 70% were Latinx. 63% earned over $200,000, 73% were smokers, and most egregious of all, only 3.2% had acid reflux, much lower than the general population, but 72% used PPI medication on a daily basis, 3 times higher than the national average. None of this makes any sense until you realize that the researchers offered a financial incentive for filling in the forms. Did this lead to some smart coders writing a script to repeatedly fill in the survey in order to collect all the rewards? I don't know, but the results have been torn to pieces. It hasn't been retracted, and it's worth noting that the lead author is the journal's editor-in-chief. A deeply inaccurate sample population was also the problem underlying the Santa Clara seroprevalence study uploaded to a preprint server by a former hero of mine, John Ioannidis, who has sadly taken his stellar reputation and drowned it in hand sanitizer during this pandemic. I don't know if he was the source of the no worse than the flu myth, but he certainly enthusiastically promoted it, and coming from someone of his stature, it became one of the most pervasive pseudoscientific messages throughout this pandemic. Ioannidis was the darling of the stats nerds and epidemiologist world for his papers dissecting why so much medical literature is faulty. I've quoted him before, and yet he appears to have fallen into every trap he's previously described: selection bias, erroneous assumptions, incorrect extrapolation, and ignoring test inaccuracy. His study claimed that COVID rates were much higher than previously considered, i.e. way more people were infected and asymptomatic, hence hugely downgrading the risk. It was, of course, picked up by multiple news agencies, the White House, people who wanted to believe that. And Ioannidis did the rounds on Fox News and the like. 4 months later and an internal investigation later, it still hasn't been published. The scientific community is struggling to understand how Ioannidis went so wrong. But here is a preprint study without peer review that has worldwide implications. Ioannidis may not have intended it, but to this day his study is still being cited by politicians as evidence that lockdowns aren't needed. And now we come to my world. Not long ago, the public were rocked by a study saying that most people with COVID have serious heart complications even months after they recover. Damn, that sounds really scary, and the media certainly made sure everyone was as scared as possible and soiled their collective pants. It has one of the highest altimetric scores for a scientific paper in recent years, meaning it's been shared thousands of times and reported on news worldwide. And it's had real implications, like influencing the cancellation of the college sports season in something called the Big Ten. I don't understand American sports, but I believe I know what that is. In summary, some very preeminent cardiologists have accused the non-randomized results of being fabricated, or at best victim to horribly bad statistical processing. The normal controls were very abnormal. The general consensus within cardiology is that the likelihood of these results being real is effectively zero. Then we had the Bakersfield 2, the walk-in clinic doctors with no expertise in epidemiology calling a press conference to expound their baseless theories and simply demonstrating their profound ignorance. They've been completely debunked. I guess I have to mention Plandemic as it's an example of how scientists can just be out and out charlatans, criminals, and liars. The fictional movie has been discussed at length elsewhere, so I won't go into it anymore. The other heinous example of fraudulent and dishonest doctors are Trump's favourite lunatics, not the Avengers that we need, but the Avengers that 2020 deserves, frontline doctors. Never has there been a clearer advertisement for the dire state of medical education in America than this ragtag group of Ben Carson wannabes with a couple of brain cells operating on some kind of timeshare deal between them. Living embodiments of that old joke, what do you call someone who graduated bottom of their class at medical school? Doctor. Frontline doctors claim to be unbiased while making no secret of their undying support for Trump and the Tea Party, and have become doyens of fair and balanced outlets like PragerU, the Tea Party YouTube channel, and of course Fox News. Members have expressed belief in alien DNA being used in vaccines, lizard Illuminati, and several of them no longer even have a medical license. And oh look, it's our old friend, the Bakersfield boob. Masks. I think this subject illustrates best the problems with communicating science to the public. We're all aware of the utterly confusing messaging on masks. Initially, we were told they don't do anything. The CDC and the Surgeon General in the USA actively discouraged masks. The retrospective explanation is that governments didn't want to create a run on PPE at a time when healthcare professionals were struggling to get adequate supplies. But this never made any sense because you're telling people they don't work and we need to save them for healthcare workers. So they do work then. The public aren't dumb. They saw through this straight away. This was the moment that it went wrong. From this point forwards, trust had been lost in the CDC and governments. Fast forward a few months and people wonder why certain members of the public are reluctant to wear masks. The UK and the US have been lessons in how not to give clear messaging to the public. There were all sorts of confusing messages around indoor and outdoor transmission instead of being clear that the risk was overwhelmingly indoors. We were getting obsessed with things like beaches. The people arguing for evidence for a non-harmful intervention like masks in the midst of a pandemic were missing the point here. Tell me what form reliable evidence would take to convince people to wear masks. We can't mask people up and expose them to COVID to test this. Why were these sticklers not demanding the same level of evidence for things like hand washing or social distancing? Masks took on this whole life of their own. People talk about Asian countries being more compliant, but I don't think that's it. They're just more aware of the risk. SARS is fresh in their memory. Wearing a mask is really not a big deal. I cannot believe we've collectively wasted so much energy on this. The people who demand randomized controlled trials are wrong. The people who say that masks are categorically proven to work are wrong. It's okay to say we're not sure, but let's err on the side of caution. And it's also made it into such an issue that people who cannot wear masks for valid medical reasons feel scared to even go anywhere now. Everyone has lost out. If the CDC and the WHO had said from day one, we don't know if simple cloth face coverings help, but they have helped for other previous viral illnesses. Masks are important at protecting others, which I don't think was really emphasized, not just yourself. We don't have time to wait for large-scale evidence, and we're asking people to participate in this very minor thing, as well as all the other things, social distancing, hand washing, when indoors, or particularly when you have symptoms, so we can all do our bit. During Spanish flu pandemic, mask wearing was seen as patriotic. If we had senior politicians and public figures wearing masks early on, normalizing it, maybe it wouldn't have become this insane partisan issue. Then, of course, George Floyd's murder prompted worldwide Black Lives Matter protests. Now, I think it's entirely fair to say that systemic racism is a monumental public health crisis. One can argue convincingly that the protests were necessary in spite of the pandemic and have a very interesting debate about risk. But what did huge damage to trust in expert was some scientists suggesting that protests were unlikely to contribute to viral spread. Some of you will recall that I praised Anthony Fauci for being consistent on this. You can be more critical of public gatherings for Vanilla Ice concerts than BLM protests in terms of their motivation, but you can't claim that the viral risk at different public events differs. And it almost We're almost at the end of the video, because the very worst example will come as no surprise to anyone. The most bizarre episode in 21st century medicine, the most baseless, cockeyed madness to reach all the way to the President of the United States and the CEO of SpaceX, Hydroxychloroquine. Again, this has been discussed to death elsewhere, and like every other doctor, I'm pretty bored of this topic by now. But in a nutshell, a deeply flawed, if not fraudulent, paper was published where patients were removed from analysis if they didn't fit their narrative. Again, in a journal with links to the lead author. It would have remained ignored and irrelevant, as it deserved to be due to the fact it was a spectacularly bad study on many levels, until Elon Musk and President Trump decided to start promoting it, leading to the sheer insanity over the last few months. How did it even come to their attention? Well, we have none other than one of the Frontline quacks to thank for that as well. It's been bolstered by the portrayal of Didier Raoult, the original author, as a maverick, devil-may-care renegade with the courage to stand up to the heartless medical profession, feeding this comical narrative that cavalier scientists must be right. Let's leave aside the deaths that have been attributed to hydroxychloroquine, or the people who depend on it for their rheumatological conditions who haven't been able to access it. We've now had hundreds of studies looking at its effect. Duplication of research like this has never been seen before. These groups could have been doing other important research, but millions of dollars worth of time and effort have been put into studying a drug which has proved to be completely useless. Of course, it was right to study it, but we didn't need 130 hydroxychloroquine trials. There's a wider point here that all non-COVID research has also taken a back seat, and that has had huge implications for health. There's another problem with so many similar studies being done. It relates to p-values. Now, we say a trial is positive if the p-value is 0.05 or 5%, but what does that actually mean? It means that 95% of the time, the result that's obtained is real, it's not due to chance. But it also means that 5% of the time, the result is just down to sheer chance and not a true difference, a representative of a real effect. Now, that's fine for most research where you just do it once, twice, maybe 3 times. But if you do 130 trials on the same drug, 5% of them will give you a false positive, which is 6 trials. And of course, those are the ones that are going to be picked up by the pro-hydroxychloroquine crowd. In my excitement that I'd done this all in one take, solely in order to have bragging rights over Tom Scott, I clean forgot to mention one of the most entertaining but truly awful chapters in this sorry story. Surgisphere are a private company that came practically out of nowhere and provided a huge patient database for researchers to use. It boasted a big data approach to research and offered 96,000 detailed medical records from 700 hospitals in 6 continents, which would allow researchers to authoritatively answer some major questions about coronavirus. Several studies used their data, but of particular note were 2 in The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, pretty much the 2 biggest medical journals in the world, with the head of Surgisphere, Sapan Desai, listed as co-author. A few weeks later, both papers had been retracted. The promise of publication in the world's leading medical journals had blinded people and prevented a few simple questions being asked in advance, like, how on earth did a tiny company of fewer than 10 people gather so much information from health systems around the world so fast? Why did they have almost no track record or web presence? Why has the boss faced several malpractice cases? And why does their staff include a science fiction writer and an adult film actress? I kid you not. It hasn't been confirmed, but it seems almost certain now that the database was fake. The reason this monumental scandal has been even more damaging is that the Lancet piece was about hydroxychloroquine, specifically showing that it doesn't work. So as you can imagine, its retraction played right into the conspiratorial beliefs of hydroxychloroquine truthers and irrevocably ruined the chances of entirely reasonable people believing the real results of subsequent hydroxychloroquine trials. To clarify, those trials are prospective randomized trials, the gold standard. Even if the Surgisphere data were real, it was an observational study. The icing on this cake, and by cake I mean steaming pile of diseased bat droppings, is that The Lancet is the same journal that ran the infamous MMR and autism study, exposed as fraudulent and subsequently retracted, but we're still dealing with the anti-vax aftermath decades later. I joke, but make no mistake, Surgisphere and the Lancet's failures have real-world consequences. Real people's health has been affected, and real lives are at stake. It's an absolute disgrace. There have now been 5 reliable hydroxychloroquine randomized controlled trials, which have all shown no effect from hydroxychloroquine and azathioprine. Believers will say the dose is wrong, the frequency is wrong, it wasn't given with zinc, which doesn't even make pharmacological sense. Please, let's just move on. Hydroxychloroquine is dead. Hydroxychloroquine and masks haven't been the only interventions divided along political lines, as more recently we've met the Tea Party. T cells, that is. And good grief, it's the fabulous flatulating frontliners again, promoting the unproven idea of T-cell immunity. They have been prolific, haven't they? Maybe I should actually ask to be a co-author on one of their papers. I quite fancy a spot on Fox News. The English accent always goes down a treat. Like the very best pseudoscience, and by best I mean worst, they take something with a kernel of truth, in this case a proposed theory, where the lead author themselves warns against over-extrapolation, and they over-extrapolate, to claim that COVID will burn out by October, that masks won't work, and that lockdowns are useless. Sadly, I've also seen a lot of friends and colleagues with medium-sized platforms on YouTube or Twitter promote flawed science as well. And these aren't clowns like Dr. Oz or the Fantastic Fools. They're smart, working doctors. If they've been taken in, you can see how easy it is unless you really analyze the data. And I get it, that takes time and it's hard. We want easy answers. And remember, if things fit our bias, we're less likely to question them. None of these phenomena are new. Yes, of course, the subject matter is new, but the people spreading misinformation are personalities we've met before. The nefarious cherry-picking and obfuscation from politicians and celebrity influencers has been seen countless times before, from vaccines to climate change and so on. But COVID has been all of these things rolled into one at 100 miles an hour. There's always been a strong cult of ignorance in modern society, as Isaac Asimov put it. He said, "The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge." But that's not enough to explain where we're at now. The dereliction of duty from some scientists has fueled the flames. Why am I even highlighting this? To erode trust in science further? I hope not. I want to tell the public that I wish we could give you straightforward answers, but that's not always possible. I want to say that some scientists are doing life-saving work that will lead us out of this, but others are cynically using it as an opportunity to line their CVs with publications. In summary, like with so many things, COVID has just highlighted pre-existing problems, in this case within science. Even when science has been done right, the people unfamiliar with how it works have been disappointed. They came in search of clear answers and were greeted with uncertainty. When offered a choice between a passionate argument with confident assertions on one hand and a scientist who hedges their bets and says, "Look, we just don't know," people who are unfamiliar with the facts naturally gravitate to the former, even if they're wrong. It's important to recognize these issues because otherwise we get to a situation where people see all these contradictory messages around and they conclude that science doesn't know anything, which quickly allows conspiracy theories to flourish, as one person's claim about COVID is just as valid as anybody else's. I've used W. Edwards Deming's words before, but I'll close with them again, because I don't want you to believe everything you read. In God we trust, all others must bring data.